Hello! It is time for another jingly noise and another Scrimba live stream. How exciting is that? I see some excitement already in the chat, and with good reason, because I'm joined today by Mike from HTML All the Things podcast. That deserves a round of applause. Who, as you can see from the letters on the screen, will be talking to us all about how to Google and level up your tech career. Exciting, yeah. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
No problem. Glad to be here. Been a fan of the show for a little while, actually.
That is great to hear. Yeah, lovely. Lots of people here, and people have already started doing our weekly, well, more than weekly actually, survey, which is this. If I can find the overlay. If you are new here, please put a rabbit in the chat. And if you've been before, put a tiger. We don't use this information. It's just to amuse ourselves. So yes, plenty of tigers already in the chat. Exciting. Oh, I've got an echo. Really? Maybe I'm using the wrong mic. I will have a look into it.
It's all good.
Says it's the right one, so I will crack on and hope it's just your sound system, Mr. Echo Reporter. Yes, so Mike, someone in the chat earlier on said, here it is, how to Google is a developer's superpower. Would you agree with that?
I 100% agree with that. I think I've ran into this a lot, and we'll talk about it throughout this live stream, but I ran into the hesitancy to admit that you Google a lot. And it's always been kind of shocking to me because obviously, like for me, I've been a developer for 7+ years now. I Google all the time, right? Like even very simple things like a for loop, for instance, sometimes will just slip out of my mind. Yeah. And I don't care because it's one Google away, maybe 3 seconds of my time to find it if you know how to Google properly. So I think for sure, Googling is like the extension of your storage capacity of your brain, right? So knowing how to do that can save you so much space that's reserved for other more important things like when to use a certain syntax and stuff like that, like when to use a for loop or an if statement, just going basic terms. But regardless, those are more important than how to actually implement it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I have certain things that just do not stick in my mind, no matter how many times I use them. It drives me mad, but they are just a Google away. As you say, I think you've kind of answered this one in a way, but are there any other reasons why Googling skills are so valuable?
Yes, I think with Googling skills, it's not only about like memory retention and stuff like that. The other things you can kind of do with it is expand on a concept. So for instance, let's say you're trying to implement I'm going to always speak in simple terms because I don't know the level of the audience, like a for loop, right? And you're iterating over an array. Initially, your thought process could be like, hey, I'm just going to use a for loop. That's how I did it 3 years ago. That's how I'm going to do it now. But as you Google, you're actually going to find other ways that you can do that, like a for each, an array operator. This we're speaking in JavaScript terms. Other languages obviously have them too. But you're going to find better ways to do things. So as you kind of hone your skills and stop looking for the easiest and fastest solution, you're also going to start looking for the best solution. And and it's going to evolve over time because 3 years ago, maybe the for loop was the way to do it. Like now, if you Google it, you're going to get the more accurate answer of, the for each.
That is a really good point, actually. If you never Googled anything, then I guess you'd only be using the technology you originally learned and you wouldn't keep it up to date. Yeah, I didn't think of that. Yeah. Debjit says, my memory capacity is 256 bytes. I can relate to that completely. Regarding the echo, it was playing in Discord as well. So that's why, not my fault. Woo. That is good to hear. Yeah. So Mike, can you run us through what a good Google strategy would look like?
Absolutely. So one thing that I've actually done recently, and this isn't exactly part of the Google strategy, is I will actually refer to documentation before I go to Google. So the first thing I do when I run into an issue or when I need to implement something, like let's say I'm working in Vue or something like that, is I'll actually check the Vue documentation first to see the way that they want you to do it. And if I don't find something there, then I go to Google, and this is where the kind of the strategy begins. I start really specific. So if I'm trying to implement something like or I'm having issues with something like a div not being able to be hidden in Vue, like while I'm programming in Vue, I'll definitely include like hiding can't hide a div in the Google search, but I'll also add Vue to that because that's the technology I'm working with. And what that allows it to do is give you a Vue specific answer, because there's obviously many ways that you can hide a div. You can use document.getElementById by ID and hide it some way. You can just erase it from the DOM. Like there's plenty of ways you can do that. But when you're using a technology or a framework, it's important to kind of add those to your Google searches to get as specific an answer as you can initially. But a lot of the times, as everyone obviously knows, you're not going to get the answer right away. So you start taking away terms. So if you don't find the answer for whatever reason, now in my case, in my example, obviously you're going to find the answer, but you might have a more specific example where you have like some sort of a database that you're using and a front end like Node and Mongo, and then a front end of Vue, and you don't know where the problem lies. So start removing one of those technologies one by one and seeing if you can find a more general answer, which will then lead you to kind of implement a more general solution. So that's my very basic Google strategy. Obviously, for every little thing, like learning new things, troubleshooting, there's completely different ones. But I like to, again, documentation first, specific query for second, and then a more broad query.
Interesting. On the documentation, do you have any tips for how you might find something as specific as that? Because I find a lot of documentation quite impenetrable, to be completely honest. Is Control or Command F your only option, or do you have any other tips?
So there's some really good documentations out there that have amazing searches. Tailwind just comes to mind. Vue's documentation is actually very good. Stuff like that. But barring searches, really, and this is why I always go back and tell people to understand the basics before they get into the more complex stuff. If you understand what conditional rendering is, if you understand what the certain terms are of we're talking front-end frameworks here, then when you have an issue in that specific spot, it's going to be a lot easier for you to go to the documentation and be like, okay, conditional rendering, oh, I found it here, and then just read up and down between the conditional rendering kind of section, right? So for instance, Svelte documentation, I really like it, but it doesn't have a search. So what I do with Svelte's documentation is I just kind of try to use my skills as much as possible to narrow down in which section it's going to be, and then I control F, like you were saying.
Yeah. So it all kind of boils down to having that base understanding before you kind of get into the nitty gritty, as it were. Yeah, that makes sense. Justice has an interesting question, which also came to my mind. I'm worried about Googling too, because I don't think I'll be able to rely on it in interviews. And I do know that some interviews don't allow Googling. But firstly, what's your take on those interviews? And secondly, how can we tackle such an interview?
So I think, first of all, interview discussion could be a whole other episode in itself, because I have a lot of takes on the interview discussion. But I don't like interviews, especially coding interviews, that don't allow you to Google. I think that is, you're asking someone to, again, memorize syntax, which is a useless skill. You're bogging them down in a very strange metric, and you're not actually getting the real developer power from them. So you're not seeing what they're actually going to be like in real life. It's just like in exams in school, and you're not able to, use your calculator or something. Obviously, in the industry, you're going to be able to use that kind of stuff. In a job, you're going to be able to use Google. So it's best for the interviewer and the company to be able to see how they utilize the tools available to them during the actual job. Now, if you're coding in like the Sahara Desert with no internet, I don't know if that's a thing. Like if you're interviewing for a company that doesn't have internet connection in certain areas, and you've got to code on the fly, maybe there's some valid, reason for that. But other than that crazy situation, I don't think there's any reason for a company not to allow Google. And when you are in an interview and Google is allowed, absolutely show how you would get to the solution, because that's for me, like I've interviewed quite like a few people. I love to see a person's troubleshooting strategy. I love to see how a person gets to an answer. And even if they don't get to an answer, that insight into like the strategies you take, because when you're an interviewer, that it's a high stress situation. So sometimes the person's not going to get to the answer. But if you show your techniques at least, then they can see like, okay, well, there's something to work with there. And that might actually get you to the next part.
Yeah, super. What happens if you do find yourself in one of these interviews where you can't Google? I mean, I can't imagine anything worse, personally. But how can you kind of navigate that?
So with interviews, I really like to ask a little bit of questions. A lot of the times when you get an interview, at least in my experience, my experience is not super broad on this topic, but regardless, what the interviewer will say is like, these are the topics we're going to be covering. Or if even in the job description, if this is going to be on React, Mongo, whatever, like there's going to be a certain amount of technologies. So before an interview that is going to be closed book, I would very much focus on those technologies. Now, yes, you might have to memorize some syntax. Yes, you might have to learn some very complex structures and stuff like that. But again, this is a one-off. So focus on it like it is a test in school. Learn it like it's a test in school. Use it like it's a test in school. And then I don't want to, this is going to be a little bit controversial, but forget it like it's a test in school, like after. Because the reality is you can't keep all that stuff in your head without, hindering yourself about the next thing that you want to do.
Yeah. No, that's a great tip. And what about if you do find yourself in a situation where you really can't remember something, or maybe you've never seen it before? Can you do pseudocode?
I think 100% you should do pseudocode, and you should be very vocal in the interview as well. Like I said before, the technique that you use to solve a problem is almost as important as actually solving the problem in an interview. So when you're stuck on something, be vocal and be like, oh, you know what? I haven't done this in a little while. You know what I would do? I would probably, and then like you said, pseudocode a little bit and be like, I would probably search up this stuff online, try to fill in the pseudocode platform, and this is how I would handle that. So again, be very vocal during the interview process about, if you can't Google, about how you would Google, because a lot of the times the interviewer themselves will be against the process of not allowing you to Google because they're just a cog in the machine, and they'll hear your method and be like, yeah, that's what I would do too, and kind of push you forward.
Yeah, totally. Interesting question from Yobin. When Googling vanilla JavaScript, Google gives me jQuery, React, other libraries. Yes, we've all been there when Google gives us a jQuery solution. Is there a way for that to not happen?
So yeah, there is a way. So there's a few operators you can try to use, but this is not going to work every time. So there's some operators like an exclude operator, which is just a dash. So you can write your JavaScript question, like, how to iterate over an array, and do a minus dash jQuery, right? And that will hopefully get you as many results as they possibly can without jQuery in the actual answer. But a lot of the times, really what happens is you'll get a Stack Overflow article. And Stack Overflow, unfortunately, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but Stack Overflow has some issues with newer questions. So you're going to get a lot of old answers in Stack Overflow that have jQuery in them. And that's good. jQuery is fine. I have nothing against jQuery, to be honest. I love jQuery for what it gave to the industry. Now, obviously, there's better ways to do things. But what happens a lot of times in those articles is the first answer is not always going to be the best. So scroll down a little bit and you might get a newer answer. And usually it'll say updated with EMCA 2016 or something like that. And that will be your kind of your way to go. That's for Stack Overflow. And again, back to the exclude, you can try the exclude first.
Interesting. Yeah. So here's an example of what it would look like from IDMX 225. So you put minus whatever you want. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. Debjit says search is my best friend. Yeah, totally. Philippe asks, do you prefer writing questions like how to make something, or is it better to write the exact term you're looking for? Example, how to display array items one by one, or rendering array items. So I suppose this is kind of asking, do you need to use human language with Google, or is it better to almost Google what you expect to see the answer to be?
So I think start with Googling what you expect to see the answer to be. That's your best bet, and that's your best chance of getting the exact answer to your question. If you start Googling like how to make an array show items, first of all, you're going to get a million different answers from a million different languages. So that's going to be really confusing. And you're going to get different use cases as well of that. Whereas if you Google how to display an array item one by one in JavaScript, you're going to get a much more direct answer to what you're trying to do.
Yeah, good tip. So circling back around to our search operators, the -1 sounds handy. Are there any others we need to know about, or do you have any resources where we can find them?
So yes, I do have a resource. Let me throw that into the chat right away, and then I'll talk about a couple of operators that I do use on a consistent basis. I don't use a lot, to be honest. I have gotten decently. Oh, one sec. My Control-C is not working. It's from Ahrefs.
Oh, it might be. I'm not sure you can post links in the chat. If you put it in the private chat, I think I should be able to.
Put it in the private chat, no problem. So the operators that I use are, again, the exclude operator, the minus sign. There's also a colon site operator. So you can search a specific site. So if you want to search like only Stack Overflow, and Stack Overflow search can be kind of spotty, you can actually put colon site Stack Overflow, right? And you can get to or I think it's Stack Overflow colon site. I can't remember the exact wording, but again, the resource is on the screen. So you can actually only search for your question on Stack Overflow or any other site if it's the MDN resources or the W3 schools, whatever you want. The last one that I use more often than not is and. So before there was a plus sign for doing like two different keywords together and only showing results for two different keywords. That plus sign has now been deprecated. That's a kind of a new thing. So you can use the capital and. So if you want to search for Vue and JavaScript solutions, the ones that have both of those terms in the answer, then you would use the capital A and D.
Yeah. This one's quite interesting.
Yes.
So wildcard. So basically, if you kind of know everything in the syntax apart from one word, you can use this, if I've understood correctly.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. If you want to match like something between the two and stuff like that. So I think the answer there is Steve wildcard Apple.
Yeah. Woo.
There we go.
Look at that. Who'd have thought? That's amazing.
Steve Wozniak as well. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, yeah. Could be controversial. Yeah, so that resource is in the chat once again, and I will be checking it out definitely after this stream. Awesome. Yeah, super cool. Any more questions coming in from the chat?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I think there's one.
Glad I made it, says Jacob. This is interesting.
Yeah, Jacob.
That is good. Yeah, so I shall move on. My other questions. So if you do all of that and no joy, which actually I had recently, I didn't think that could ever happen, but it did happen to me. What can you do if Googling does not solve your problem?
This happens. Honestly, it's happened to me many times when the problem is just too specific for you to Google. Like it happens. It's just something that will happen as you actually evolve as a developer. This will happen more and more to you. And you're going to have to rely on multiple different things. So the main one for me, and this is something, again, we'll talk about a little bit more as well, is asking for help. And this can be done in many different ways. One of them is directly asking like a mentor or someone that you know has more experience than you, or has someone that you know that has more experience than you than in this specific thing that you're Googling, right? So if it's something like you're having issues with a library is a very common one that you can't Google. Because if a library is only used by X amount of people, then there are probably going to be some issues with you finding the answers, right? So like a backend library like sanity.io or Strappy or something like that. You're using those, you run into an issue. The best thing to do is ask someone that's already used it, but there's multiple other ways. One of them is to join a Discord or a Slack group. They have most larger libraries at least have them. Sanity and Strappy do for sure. And then the other way is, let's say it's a really tiny library, and this has happened to me many times. Like you're trying to implement I can't even remember what it was, some sort of iterator or something like that, some sort of very specific thing to your task, and you just can't get something to work because it doesn't work with X library or whatever. You can go into the GitHub of that, whatever that library is, and post an issue, or even search in the issues of that GitHub. I found that the search there is really important. So one thing that you should 100% do first before you post an issue, and to clarify, is to search closed and open issues. because a lot of the time when you post an issue, someone's going to already do that for you and kind of point to them. Now, some people can be really snarky about it, which is kind of just, don't do that. Don't be snarky. Just point them to the right one. But regardless, you're going to be saving time for the people that are actually maintaining the library if you do that. So again, 3 different things. One is ask someone that's already done it, or ask someone that that's done it. That's not possible sometimes. The next thing is try to join a community that is based around these things. So Slack or Discord or whatever other communities exist. And third, try to go into the GitHub issues and see if that question's already been asked.
Great tips. And on this, conveniently, I have the link to Scrimba's Discord community, which a couple of people have mentioned in the chat. Yes, come along. We have dedicated help channels for various technologies and a general channel if your question doesn't fit into there. Oh, that's interesting about searching GitHub issues. Yeah, so related to that, Jacob asks, have you ever searched GitHub repos for how something like an open source tool has been implemented? Well, example, connecting Firebase or MongoDB. It's interesting to see how others code their projects. So this is a good point, because even if you know the answer to something or know how to do something, it might be worth Googling anyway.
I like that. I like that idea because you might get a better idea of how to do it. I'm running into this currently with a side project that I have where I know how to do certain things, but I know that some of the stuff that I'm doing, some of the structures, some of the code structure isn't industry standard or whatever you want to call it. So I will actually go and Google the proper way of doing it. Now, the first thing I do usually, again, is documentation. But like Jacob's saying, another really great approach is to see if you can find an open source project that has done something similar to what you've done, like implementing a Firebase DB and stuff like that. Because what that shows you how to do is, again, exactly like kind of a way of a different thought process to what you're doing, and maybe a more correct one. Now, I say maybe a more correct one because sometimes that can lead you astray. If the GitHub repo, if the GitHub repo has many stars and everyone's kind of complimenting it and people are suggesting it, then maybe it's a great one. But if the GitHub repo has no action in it, it's really difficult to know, like, is my way better or is their way better? So that's, again, maybe something that you can ask a Discord group, maybe something that you can just experiment with, maybe something you can reason out yourself.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. Could be a double-edged sword. So watch out. Ooh, Michael R says, oh yes, unfortunately this spirals into days of research for me. Yes, a rabbit hole.
Yeah, you want to avoid that. You want it to be a quick thing. If you're going to be trying to improve every little thing that you're doing in a project, you're not going to get a project done. So that's just the reality of it. So you have to trust your instincts. And sometimes your instincts might be a little bit outdated, or they might be a little bit non-standard practice, but they're still going to get the job done. So just get, like, the most important thing when you're building a side project or a project is to get it done. If you're working for a client, they want results. They don't care that you put this together with the most efficient way possible so that it can work on computers from 20 years ago. They just don't care. That's the reality of it. So don't get bogged down. Don't go down that rabbit hole too much. Use it sparingly, and just use it to kind of better yourself a little bit.
Yeah, totally. Perfect is the enemy of done.
Yes.
So on to my next question now, which is, when is the right time to ask a question on Stack Overflow? I have never done this. Not sure I ever would. The reason being is the second part of my question. Any tips for not getting sarcastic answers on there? Yeah,
this one is, I have had very limited success in asking a Stack Overflow question. I've asked probably 15 of them, and I've had one answer out of those 15 that actually led me to a solution. And even that answer was snarky. Right? So
wow.
The other 14 were 0 responses whatsoever. No, sorry, not the other 14. Probably like 12 of those were 0 responses, and another 3 were just like people demeaning me, essentially saying that this is a stupid question that's been answered a million times without linking to any answer.
Wow.
So I'm of the thought that at this point in time, Stack Overflow is a very, very good database of how to solve little problems. But as a way to actually like expand that database, it's very difficult because you have to be really entwined with searching Stack Overflow to find the correct answer and to find another answer. And if you don't do what they want you to do, there will be snarky comments. I don't know if they're planning on fixing it. I know they were just acquired. So hopefully there's some sort of plan in place to get that toxicity a little bit out of there. Like I know my podcast partner, business partner, he was on Stack Overflow for a while. He actually got some reputation on there, but all of a sudden he started like posting questions, and there was a certain group of people that were just kind of attacking him every time, to the point where they were downvoting him specifically so that he couldn't answer any more questions. So there's a system in place there that if you're downvoted enough times, they'll actually stop you from answering questions and commenting. And he got to that point. So it's a very strange ecosystem. Again, I use it as a resource. I do not use it as a way to ask questions anymore.
That is interesting. So Caffeinated Pixels, I think that answers your question of, is it ever worth posting a question on Stack Overflow? Tom Chance says, the best time to use Stack Overflow is when the flames are licking at your feet and not before. However, Heidi has had a good experience with SO. At least half of my questions got good and helpful responses.
There's got to be people out there that had good experiences, right? Like there
wow,
has to be.
yeah.
That's good.
We found one of them.
Well done, Heidi.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Philippe asks, is there a good alternative for Stack Overflow for asking questions?
So this is where it comes back to what I was saying before: Discord groups, Slack channels, and issues, GitHub issues. I think GitHub issues is a very, very good place to ask questions, because if you found something wrong, then other people can benefit from that. And it's directly in that, like co-find in that project. And GitHub issues are actually still Google, like they still index on Google. So you can Google something, get a GitHub issue, and solve your problem, which is awesome. Like Discord and Slack channels, unfortunately, aren't like databases of answers, which kind of sucks, because that's the advantage of having a Stack Overflow. But I think anything that tries to compete with Stack Overflow will eventually become Stack Overflow, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Because if we made a new Stack Overflow and called it Nice Overflow, maybe you could just permanently ban anyone who was snarky. But then it's hard
those
to
are the
please.
people answering questions, though. That's the thing. Like those are the people that they get the reputation and they get that kind of feeling of importance, and they are the ones that are driving that community forward. It's a difficult one to balance. I don't know how to fix it.
No, me neither. Never mind. Moving on. Does Googling have any unexpected side effects, good or bad?
So yes, I think I was mentioning this a little bit before. One of the things with Googling is like you might get a better solution than you were even thinking of, and you might advance your career a little bit as you're Googling, because you're starting to get newer solutions, you're starting to get more efficient solutions, and you're starting to better yourself in a way that you wouldn't have if you were just kind of siloed into your own development environment and just coding with 3-year-old knowledge. The web development industry, the development industry in general, moves at a ridiculously rapid pace. I always like to say that we're still in the Wild West of web development and development in general. Like there's no standards, there's barely any like solid ground to stand on. And if you start looking for that ground and if you start basing yourself in there, you're going to get caught behind. And again, there's nothing wrong with being a little bit behind. I think being a year behind there's nothing wrong with that. Being a couple of years behind even maybe. But as soon as you start getting like a little bit too far, and then you need to go into the job sphere, you might have some trouble looking for like the more optimal positions. There's a chance.
Yeah, definitely. So it can keep you up to date. Yeah. That is good. Caffeinated Pixel says, nice overflow. Sounds like a good day for a plumber. Well, there you go. It's a double business idea for someone out there. Jacob says, honestly, I hadn't heard of HTML, all the things before, but you've just gained a new listener. Great news. Yeah.
That's awesome, Jacob. Thank you.
Yeah, looking forward to that. So, with all this Googling knowledge you've given us, do you have any tips for managing the results of your searches?
So yeah, I have a few tips here. I know you have one. I'll let you say it at the end, and it's actually a really good one. I looked it up after. It's called Grepper. But anyway, for me, I actually do it differently. I work with Jira a lot with my clients. So whenever I Google something that's related to a Jira ticket and I find the solution, I'll actually store that solution, that link, in the Jira ticket itself. Because if I ever need to go back and I have that same problem, I can search through my Jira tickets and find the problem that I was having and the solution in it. So, and the other side benefit of that is that if I pass on the project to someone else and they have the same issue, I kind of tell them that I do this and they can go back and Google it as well. So that's one way I do it. Another way I actually do it is I use bookmarking a lot, and just standard bookmarking. I don't have any extensions. I clean my bookmarks pretty often. And whenever I'm working on something right now, like if I'm working on my side project, for instance, I'll have a separate folder for that side project, and anything that I find in like a solution that I find for that side project or an idea or something, I'll store it in that folder, the bookmark folder. And then when time comes, I'll archive it in like an archive folder as well. So if I ever need to go back, I still have access to it, but my bookmarks are kind of still clean. So those are the kind of the two ways that I manage it, but I do like your way as well. I've been kind of looking at it.
Yeah. So nice, smooth transition there. I recently found out through the Scrimba Discord community, actually, about this Chrome extension called grepper. So what happens with grepper is once you've installed it, let's say you need to Google generate random number JS, which as you can see, I do Google a lot. You then get the code snippets up top, and then you can add your grepper answer in here, which I've probably already added this one actually. And then, yeah, you get some kind of coin. I haven't actually figured out what that coin does yet, but it's nice anyway. And then you can find all these various solutions. But the main reason I like it is because it kind of hones in on the answer very easily. And it's nice and easily to copy and paste. So yeah, it's a win-win. grepper is the name of it. I'll put the name of that in the chat. Thank you to Jose for telling us about it.
That's cool.
Lovely. So I would like to know now a little bit about the career side of things, if that's okay. So leveling up your tech career. We did have a question earlier on from Michael LaRocca, but it's way up in the chat. So Michael, if you wouldn't mind copying and pasting your question, I will now ask it. But in the meantime, I will ask. I didn't catch that. Could you? Siri. Yeah, Siri. In the meantime, Siri will be quiet, and I will ask Mike, how can people level up their junior coding skills?
This is a great question. I get asked this quite often. So if you're already a junior developer, let's say we're putting in that mindset because it's different for every stage of your career. If you're a junior developer, honestly, the best way you can level up your skills is to start building projects in your side, like side projects in your time, the time that you have, because you can take courses. Sure. There's nothing really wrong with that. You can take a nice Udemy course and it'll teach you some best practices and stuff. But the way at least I retain information, and it could be different for other people, but the way I do it is I'll have a project in mind, something like I need a habit tracker. I'm trying to form some habits right now. Yes, I can go out and find a habit tracker that will do that for me, but I need one that specifically caters around me. Like maybe I do 3-day habits or something, something that works for me that I know works for me. So I'll build a little side project that caters to a specific problem that I have. And while doing that, I'll try to kind of learn the full stack solution as I'm building, and that will accelerate your development process very quickly. So there's one way you can, if you're going through a course, you're following along and you're building a project with the instructor, sure. But it's a totally different mindset. And it takes that little shift where it's your own project and you're able to then apply those skills that I was talking about with Googling. You're able to apply the skills of just trying to hammer out a problem, because as a developer, you're a problem solver. That's your number one thing that you do. You're not a code writer. You're not anything. You have to solve problems. And you're going to get into roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And the only way to get better at that is to throw roadblocks at yourself and try to get through them. And at some point, you'll see it. You'll start clicking that, you're not going to get afraid of roadblocks anymore. And you're going to get into the system where you're like, oh, good, another roadblock. This is how I'm going to try to solve it. And that's it. The only way to do that is through actually coding and actually solving problems. So go and code is the best way to level up as a junior coder.
Totally. Yeah. Jacob says, I love that idea. Building custom projects that you can use. You're effectively your own first customer. Yeah, totally. Then you get the testing in it as well. Yeah, that's great. Oh, Michael has reposted his question. Will having an online presence for blogging, YouTube, etc., benefit you in applying for a first developer position, especially in regards to career changes?
I think 100% yes. This is something that I've recently started to implement in my, first of all, in my own approach for finding work and stuff like that, but also in the approach that I do when I interview people. So I was a tech lead at a startup for about 3 years prior to the last few months. And I was interviewing as part of my job. I had to interview people. And I would always kind of poke them at like, hey, like what, you know, what's your passion? Like where do you, what do you do? And a lot of the times they would have, they did some projects for a boot camp or something like that, and that's it. But the people that really stood out were the ones that were like, hey, I made this site for my D&D group or something, where we could all post our character sheets and we could all update them together and stuff like that. And like, and then they would go into a deep discussion about the site and the structure that they made to do it. That passion that you have for those side things bleeds through. And same with blogging. So let's say you're in an interview and you're talking about iterating over an array. You can mention in that interview, be like, give them the answer and be like, yeah, I wrote like 4 or 5 blog posts just on this topic, actually. And you can like tell them where you wrote those blog posts. Mm. That is the kind of like little passion that can bleed through and put you on a different level than the other applicants, because that shows that you're not only understanding the concepts, you're ready to teach the concepts. And that's that, as everyone knows, the teaching part is a totally different skill. And not only that, when you're writing those blog posts, you're going to solidify your skills 1,000 times more. When you're in the mindset of like, hey, I've got to teach someone this at the lowest level possible, that makes you learn things at the lowest level possible and learn them better than you were just like rushing through and trying to solve a problem.
Yeah. It's also an opportunity to show off some skills that maybe don't come up in the technical interview. So you can't show off everything in there, I guess, but if you've written a blog post about it, there's a chance they might see it. So yeah, absolutely. Definitely worth doing, Michael. Yeah, lovely. So we touched a little bit on building projects and how that's useful for junior developers. Is it also useful for people before that stage?
Yes. Honest, I'm a project-based learner. I've talked a lot about project-based learning on the podcast. I've talked a lot about project-based learning to just random coworkers and stuff like that. I think for me, that's how I would learn. And if you're just starting out, it might be a little bit too ambitious to think like, oh, I'm just going to build this massive project, right? But the idea is, in my head, is that you pick something that you want to build. And instead of just going randomly and looking at courses and stuff like that and just trying to do courses, you pick the YouTube videos and the courses that can apply to your project. And what that'll do is it'll give you that seed that while you're learning the course, like you're learning JavaScript or something, you're going to be like, oh, wait, I can apply that to this project. And then as soon as you finish that course, you can go back and be like, okay, let me build this little system here. Just that little system that I was thinking of. And that, again, that interest in something that you're building for yourself or something you're building for someone else will accelerate your knowledge heavily. Like it'll be kind of like a cheat code, because you're going to have that passion. You're going to have the commitment, like you're investing in it because you want to use it.
Yeah, totally. This is what we're trying to do with the Weekly Web Dev Challenge. So we give people challenges, and they can be quite basic. So if you're a beginner, you just do the kind of basic challenge. But what's nice about it is people kind of build it up, and they build all kinds of amazing different things. And I nearly always find things that I've never seen before. So it's amazing, really. So you can use something like this and kind of make it your own.
I love that. And honestly, like it's a really good little technique to use. Let's say you're doing these challenges or you're doing a course project. My advice to everyone is pick something really small and change it. So if this is the 8-ball challenge, right? So if it's an 8-ball challenge, then maybe pull in some quotes from an API or something for the 8-ball. You know what I mean? Like just something really small. Just find that really small thing, because again, that gets you that to shift your mind a little bit and have to troubleshoot and problem solve on your own while still having that structured platform of like an assignment, a course, a project or something to follow.
Yeah, that's it. So you don't have to build a huge project from scratch. Just get building something. You can add a balcony to your building, so to speak. Yeah.
I like that.
So a lot of people ask me this question. I'm not sure what the answer is. Do people need to learn data structures and algorithms to get a job in tech?
Yeah, so the key there is to get a job, right, in tech and not to actually be in tech or something. So this one's a difficult one. If you're a web developer, right? Like let's say you're looking for a web design job. Like you just want to build website, HTML, CSS, a little bit of JavaScript. A lot of agencies I've noticed, I've stopped asking these data structures and algorithms questions. They'll ask you specific questions to laying out a website. They'll ask you specific questions to SEO and stuff like that. But they'll put those data structures and algorithms on the side because they're weeding out too many good employees, and their like pricing scale is a little bit different too. So for those jobs, and you can usually find out if they ask you data structures and algorithms by either the job description or by literally asking them, then no, you don't technically need to know data structures and algorithms. But for a lot of jobs, a lot of them still, you're going to need to know them for the interview, because there's going to be a whiteboard portion or a take-home portion where you're going to have to explain some binary tree structures or how does a linked list work, stuff like that. And yes, you might use those during your job depending on how complex it is. But most of the time, from my experience, you're probably not going to have to build a binary tree from scratch. You're going to implement a binary tree that's already been built, and you're just going to need to know how to use it, which is a completely different subset of skills than building it from scratch. So in my opinion, again, goes back to that conversation that we were having before with the interview. The interview system we have right now is broken. And there's no, like, I'm not saying that there's a way to fix it. I'm not saying what's the best way to do it, but I'm just saying, like, we need to rethink it a little bit and try to get the best talent for the job instead of trying to put people through kind of quote unquote hell and see who sticks.
That sounds like a good idea, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So long story short, you might have to know it, but hopefully we're moving towards not knowing it.
Yeah. for at least, a portion of, obviously there's some jobs where it comes in handy, like you need it. If you're doing some sort of like data optimization work and you need to make sure that the data is compressed in a perfect way, sure, that job should ask you data structure and algorithms 100% because you're going to be using them. But if you know the job's not going to ask you them, like why put a person through that?
Yeah, totally. Denny says, no professionals use the FizzBuzz algorithm. I don't know if that's a real algorithm, but who knows? Yes.
It's not. It's just again an interview question about like writing FizzBuzz in a certain pattern. It
sounds useful.
I don't understand it. I've never been able to apply the skills that I gained from figuring out how to do a FizzBuzz to an actual job.
Wow. Yeah. Well, hopefully interviews will go in the right direction soon, which brings me to my next question. What's the best way to prepare for a coding interview?
So this is a really good question. I don't have a ton of experience doing a lot of interviews. Luckily for me, I've done a lot of contract to hire approaches, but I have done a few and I have interviewed people. What my suggestion to you is, again, going back to the other system, try to figure out what the interview is going to be about. Is it going to have data structure and algorithms? You can do this by, again, checking stuff like Glassdoor, checking, asking the company what kind of stuff is going to be covered. I know I've been asked that many times as the interviewer, and I've always been upfront being like, hey, we're going to cover PHP. We're going to cover JavaScript. This is what we're going to cover. I'll see you next week. And they have all that opportunity to, focus exactly on what I'm going to cover. And I hardly ever throw curveballs. So as a person that's trying to figure out what to cover, try to, again, ask as many people, figure it out online. You can check Reddit sometimes. They'll have some posts about a job. But once you have that knowledge of what they're going to cover, focus in on that. A lot of the times you won't be able to Google. So you need to know these things off the top of your head. Practice a lot. Do stuff like lead code problems. I do those sometimes just for fun, which is kind of an insane thing to do, but it helps me with like imposter syndrome. But regardless, like do those little algorithm problems like FizzBuzz, because as much as we're kind of crapping on it right now, it's something that's still in the industry. You're going to need to know it. And the more you do it, the easier it is going to be for you on the actual interview. And the other thing is, like, when you're in the interview, don't try to guess things. The interviewer is not going to expect you to know 100% of the answers to all the questions that they give you. They want to see your reasoning, how you get to an answer. Again, back to that thing. How do you get to an answer, or how would you solve this problem? So if you don't know something, be like, hey, I don't know this. I didn't cover it in a while, but this is how I would find out. I would go on Google. I would go to the documentation. I would find out. Tell them how you would get to the answer if you don't know something. Don't guess. Don't be like, oh, I think it would be this. Because let's say best case scenario, you guess correctly. They're going to ask you a follow-up on that. And now you're going to be like stuck with your pants down trying to answer a follow-up on a question you don't even know.
Yeah, that's true. And that's the best case scenario.
Yep.
Yeah. Good advice. Jackie Jackson is asking if college matters when you're applying for jobs. So yeah, how would you approach being a self-taught learner and applying for jobs?
So this is kind of a touchy subject recently for whatever reason, but I graduated college. I put it on my resume. Sure. I think it's important. I think like graduating, great. Like it's really good. It can give you a certain set of skills for how to learn. I'm not even talking about the knowledge you gain in college. It's more like the process of learning something. And it gives you the indication, or it gives the employer an indication that, hey, this person can stick through a 4-year program. That says something. Having said that, if you're a self-taught developer, which is a lot of people out there, you know how you can show people the dedication? By doing the projects that I was talking about before. If a person sees that, hey, instead of an education section, you have a project section, and you have 3 projects with 3 different GitHub repos or something like that, and they see your process of solving a project, that could be very, very useful for them to decide if they want to hire you or not. And it's absolutely not impossible for you to get a job, even a really good job, like with a large FANG company. Like I've heard of this before, where people have gotten jobs, but based on the previous work they've done, and they didn't even graduate. I know we had one group, like 2 people in our college program, that were able to secure jobs at Google through like a little side project that they were working on through college, and they didn't even bother finishing. So they were in the second year. They're just like, oh, we got jobs at Google, and they both went and interviewed and got the jobs and went and lived in New York, I think it was, or something. So I'm not saying that like college doesn't help you, because I think it does for the reasons I mentioned before. But I think as a self-taught developer, you still have the opportunity to get those interviews and to get those jobs if you put in the effort. If you're just going to put no education, no projects, nothing on your resume, yeah, you're going to have an issue. But if you show to the employer that, hey, I'm able to do this, like here's the evidence, then they're going to consider you.
Yeah, totally. Great advice. I'd like to talk a bit about situations on the job, I suppose I can frame it as. And one of my questions is, any tips on when to ask for help versus working out for yourself? So by this, I mean, you don't want to be the person constantly asking, but you also don't want to be stuck for 2 weeks on the same thing.
Exactly.
How do you know when to ask?
So this is something that I struggle with, so I have some perspective on it. I didn't ask for help enough, and I think it's a very good skill to have, and it's a very thing. It is like, it's tough to put yourself out there and asking for help in a job, especially when you're just starting out, because you're like, I want to prove myself, but you're also hindering yourself by not doing it. So my rule of thumb for let's say a junior developer first starting out, try to figure out the answer for approximately 30 minutes. And I know that's not a lot of time, but honestly, if you can, prove to yourself that you can't solve something in 30 minutes, 7 hours down the line, you might be able to get it, but is that really worth it? Where you can just go and ask someone. And the thing is that a lot of the times when you go and ask someone a question, you're not going to get a direct answer. You're actually going to get this is how I would solve that problem, like a direction to go, and for you to then go back and be like, oh, okay, this is what it is. And a lot of the times it's not because you don't know how to solve it, it's because you're asking the wrong question. So asking someone will allow them to quickly give you an idea of what the right question is, and you can go back and solve it yourself. So again, as a junior developer, I would ask a lot of questions, but don't ask, like, like Leanne's saying, don't ask a question every 5 seconds. Give yourself a half an hour, try to solve it, try to Google it, try to do it, try to troubleshoot, check the directory, the FAQ and all that, check the docs, and then be like, okay, when you go and ask it, be like, hey, I spent some time on this. I did this, this, and this. I couldn't get it to work. Always give them that, like, what you've done already, because then they know that, hey, this person isn't just like asking a question randomly. This person has tried it and failed. And most developers will be very happy to answer.
Yeah, no, that's a great tip. And Heidi's asking, will this stream be available later? Indeed, it will, on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to send it to your son who's just starting out in the field.
That's awesome.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. No, that is a really good tip. And I think you're totally right about, if you haven't worked it out in 30 minutes, 7 hours down the line, it's iffy. And asking someone at least will give you an idea of if you're on the right track or, completely barking up the wrong tree. Yeah. But how about then on this, if you find yourself in a situation where you have absolutely no idea how to solve a problem, how can you kind of do that initial research if you're really flummoxed?
Yeah. So how can learners or junior devs tackle coding problems that they have no idea how to solve? This is a really good question. It's very difficult, and this is why I say the reaching for asking is a really good way to start. But if you're completely on your own, let's say you're in a company that hired you to complete a whole system, poor junior developer, but that happens. Like, that's not out of the realm of possibility. And you're completely on your own. All the other developers are tied up. I would try to Google a solution. So like Jacob said earlier on in the stream, there's plenty of open source projects out there that have implemented certain things that you're probably trying to implement. Try to Google and try to find an actual project that's done this. You can go on GitHub and try to find it. You can go on Google. You can go on anything and try to find a project that's already kind of done it from at least point A to point like B. And then you have to take it yourself, obviously, all the way to Z or something like that. But that little bit of start for you, that basic scaffold, that basic idea of where to start is what you're looking for in this part. Because again, you're not going to be able to ask the right questions, even Google the right questions on Google, if you have no idea how to tackle the problem. So you need to give yourself all that you can to get from point A to B. Don't think about don't think about solving the entire project. You need to start the project. And then you'll start slowly working at it one piece at a time, breaking it up into tasks and figuring it out. But it's the hardest thing, again, is to get from point A to B, not from point A to Z.
Yeah, no, interesting point there. Danny Thompson's dropped in. Hello, Danny.
Hey, Danny.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. Yeah. Danny says the first thing you should do is restate the problem in your own words. Yeah.
That's good.
I think that's, half of the problem sometimes is kind of getting the question out of your brain and into Google. Exactly. So, that is a very good tip. Oh, Danny has a question for you. Mike, I want to get better at HTML. Is there a resource or podcast that you would recommend listening to?
So this is, Danny. I was on one of Danny's spaces recently. He had the same thing. It was great. But there, like our podcast, for sure, we cover some HTML stuff, but it's not just HTML actually. So for sure, check out our podcast. We have some episodes dedicated to HTML, CSS purely because we love that stuff. We are very much about the basics. Try to, get a pillar built. Try to get your HTML pillar, try to get your CSS pillar, try to get your JavaScript pillar built, and then move on to everything else. So we talk about that a lot, but we have a ton of other stuff. And the HTML in our name is just because, hey, we needed something to, put that we like the basics, we like web development and stuff like that. And then all the things part of it is actually just like that meme. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's a meme of like click all the things. And that's that part. But yeah, thanks for that, Danny. Thanks for allowing me to give it a shout out. Appreciate you.
Yeah, lots of interesting topics to listen to. Link dropped in the chat. So check it out. I had a listen today. Very nice topics. So yes, go over there ASAP. Andre asks, CSS, Bootstrap or Sass? Which should I use?
That's a good one. So personally, I use Tailwind right now. But again, there's so many great tools out there. SCSS, I've been looking into that recently. It's like a precompiler for CSS. I think that one is fantastic. You can do a lot with it, like nesting loops and stuff like that. And you can kind of organize your CSS based on how your HTML is organized, which is kind of cool. But
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything wrong with just like, again, I go back to the 3 pillars. If you learn CSS, jumping to Tailwind, jumping to SCSS, jumping to all these different frameworks is going to be really easy. It's almost going to be trivial for you. It's just going to be another thing that you have to learn rather than being like a whole other thing. So always start with CSS. If you're just learn it pretty well, and then move on to any of these other frameworks. Bootstrap is great. I don't want to say anything bad about Bootstrap as well. I think I've used it in many, many projects in the past. I've just moved on to a more inline CSS method with Tailwind. I like that a little bit better. It makes it a little bit more faster for me and stuff like that. So that's why I use it. But again, they're all great.
Yeah, I completely agree about getting the basics down first. That's what we always say on Scrimba. What other good habits should developers foster?
Yeah, so this one's interesting. For a developer, the most important thing for you when you're first, not even when you're first starting out, as you get comfortable with development, is finding the hours of the day that you can get the most amount of work done. Because for us, like, we can get distracted really easily, and that'll completely derail us and stuff like that. But for every person, there's different sets of hours that are like their deep work hours. For me, it's anywhere between 8 a.m. till about 1 p.m. So those are my most productive hours. So what I try to do is I make the habit of blocking out that time as much as I possibly can. Obviously, there's different situations, interviews and stuff like that where I can't. But I try to do as best I can to block out that time to focus on working on projects. And when I do, I always get like 2 or 3 times more work done in that 4-hour span than I do in the next 7 hours after that, right? If I were to work like a 10-hour day or something like that. So that's one thing. The other thing for a developer is commit often. This is something that I struggle with sometimes. I recently posted on Twitter about how I forgot to commit during like a 2-day sprint, and that was a disaster. But regardless, commit often. Because after every feature that you build, that's when you should commit. Like, so you build that, adding a task or something like that to your to-do list, commit. You add a UI element, commit as often as seems fit. Don't be afraid to commit, several times a day, like, 5-6 times a day. It's not a big deal. It's better to commit more than to commit less, if that makes sense. Because as you go back, and if you're building a side project, let's say, that you're trying to get people to notice you on, they're actually going to go in and see your structure, like how you went through solving that project. They're going to check your commit messages. That's going to be something that a potential employer will absolutely take a look at. And if they see an initial commit with everything in there and that's it, that's going to be a red flag. I promise you. Like, I've had this discussion with many hiring managers and stuff like that. That's always a red flag. So commit often, commit with descriptive text. Try to be, casual about it. You don't have to commit like every little thing, but try to make it so that a person that's looking at your project can see the journey for you from start to finish.
What we need, I'm showing my age here, but do you remember in Word, we used to have that paperclip telling us to save? We need a VS Code, one of those, telling us to commit. Everyone hated that paperclip, but I found it quite helpful.
Clippy.
There we go.
I remember it really well.
Also, you could change it to a dog or a cat or various others. Yeah.
Someone should make an extension for VS Code. That's a side project.
Yeah, totally. Maybe I should.
Yeah, exactly.
One more question, as our hour, unbelievably, is almost up. Wow. We've touched a bit on side projects. I want to ask you about side hustles, by which I mean means of making money outside of your 9-to-5. So there's a lot of talk on Twitter about these. Does everyone need to have one?
Absolutely not. I think not everyone needs to have one. It's something that you should be very deliberate about having, because like the difference between a side project and a side hustle is fairly big, because a side hustle is meant to generate income. That's your goal, right? That's going to actually affect almost every part of that project. So with a side project that generates income, or side hustle that generates income, you have to not think about the technology. Like the technology is one of the last things you think about. You have to think about the marketing. You have to think about the people that you're going to be advertising to. You have to consider like how much money is it going to cost to do X and Y and Z. Like there's just a lot of other considerations to be made. And then you go to the technology. And what I usually recommend for a side hustle is actually picking not something that you want to learn, but something that you're really, really comfortable with, because you're only going to have maybe 40% of your time to spend on actually building it, and the other 60% to market it, to be in the community, promoting it, to just establishing connections for it and stuff like that. That's more of what a side hustle is. Whereas a side project is very much focused on the actual technology and the learning process. So side hustles are not for everyone in any way, shape, or form. Side projects are more so because, especially when you're trying to learn and stuff like that, and you're trying to get up in the industry, I think it's a really important thing to do. But yeah, so that would be my answer.
Yeah, good answer. I'm just going to wrap up now with quick fire questions here. Debjit, I commit a huge portion. Is it wrong? It would be better to break it down into smaller chunks, I think is fair to say. Yeah, as Mike said a bit earlier.
Exactly. It's fair to say. And not only that, like, it's not wrong. Like, obviously, like, you're still getting stuff done. That's great. Don't beat yourself up about it, but go back and be like, hey, where could I have broken this up? And then try to move forward with that.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Ben says, what IDE do you recommend?
VS Code.
Me too.
Yep.
And finally, SKB says, I'm not being consistent with my JavaScript for days now. How do I become more consistent? I recommend Scrimba's Learn JavaScript course. The reason this will help you with that, other than I have to say that, is it is broken down into very short lessons. So it's very easy to dip in and out of it, but they're also very entertaining. So you'll find yourself doing many of them and not just one. So that is my hot tip for today. Yes. Well, that brings us to the end of the hour. I would like to re-emphasize my desire for you all to build a magic 8-ball in the latest weekly web dev challenge. That would be lovely. And join us on Friday. We will be coding a JavaScript clock. This is not the current weekly web dev challenge. We did that last week because there were 2 weeks to do the challenge. It's an old one, but it looks good. So yes, Michael Pumpkin and I will be doing that on Friday.
Sounds fun.
Hope to see you all there. Yes. Well, thanks very much for joining us, Mike. It was brilliant to have you. And yeah, everyone go and check out Mike's podcast, because that looks fabulous. And if you enjoyed this, hit subscribe for more Ask an Expert live streams and other live streams. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leanne. It was awesome.
Yeah. Thanks very much. See you all next time.